I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens. But it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
Canada is on the verge of an economic shift that could change its future. What began as an attempt to protect the national auto industry has turned into a crisis affecting every corner of the country, from Ontario's factories to Saskatchewan's farms. The 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles announced by Ottawa at the end of 2024 was intended as a powerful move against Beijing's growing influence. But today, this step is dividing the economy and pushing Canada toward a difficult choice: retreat or double down.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
When the government introduced the tariffs, it promised to give Canadian automakers a chance to catch up with their competitors. Chinese companies, backed by powerful state support, were capturing markets around the world, from Europe to Latin America. Tariffs seemed to be the only way to buy time. But instead of a respite, Canada was hit from the other side. Beijing did not wait. The response was swift and painful. Canadian canola, the pride of the prairies, was hit with 75% tariffs. For thousands of farmers, this meant the loss of their main buyer and billions of dollars in elevators. While farmers took to the streets in protest, politicians in Ottawa tried to save face. Ministers spoke of strategic necessity, but tensions were mounting within the government. By mid-2025, even supporters of the hardline began to admit that the price of protecting the auto industry was too high. And then a man whom many called a possible future Prime Minister, Mark Carney, entered the scene. His words about the need for flexibility and economic realism sounded like a signal. For the first time in a year, the government openly talked about a possible tariff review.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Meanwhile, the auto industry, for which it all began to crack at the seams. Sales of electric vehicles plummeted by almost half. Prices rose and incentives for buyers disappeared. Consumers abandoned the idea of a green transition, and entire provinces curtailed their subsidy programs. Chinese brands, which could have offered affordable and technologically advanced models, were left out in the cold. Instead of growth, there was stagnation. Instead of modernization, there were closed factories and falling investment. But the economic storm was not limited to Canada. South of the border, in Washington, Donald Trump once again made Canada the target of his attacks. His new tariffs on Canadian exports and statements about the 51st state became a turning point. Canada's response was unexpected, a silent but palpable boycott. Millions of Canadians stopped traveling to the US. The flow of tourists collapsed, and hundreds of American businesses dependent on their northern neighbors began to count their losses. Now Canada is at a crossroads. Removing the tariff means admitting defeat. Keeping it means continuing to lose billions in loans. Mark Carney knows that any decision will change not only the domestic economy, but also the balance of power on the continent. America is weakened by its own sanctions, China is waiting, and Canada is stuck between two giants, trying to protect its interests and not drown in their confrontation.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Canada has long prided itself on its role as a peaceful mediator in world politics, a country that does not seek confrontation but knows how to defend its principles. However, at the end of 2024, everything changed. Against the backdrop of China's growing dominance in the electric vehicle sector and alarming reports of Canadian car factories closing, the government decided to strike a decisive blow. For the first time in recent history, Ottawa took such a tough protectionist step, imposing 100% tariffs on all Chinese electric vehicles. This decision was accompanied by loud statements about protecting jobs, industrial independence, and manufacturing sovereignty. Ministers assured that this was how Canada would be able to survive in the new global race for technology. But even then, experts warned, when you declare a trade war on China, be prepared for it not to end with a single shot. Initially, the public reaction was mixed. In the central provinces, especially Ontario and Quebec, the decision was met with applause. For the auto industry, it sounded like a long-awaited respite. Chinese brands, which were actively expanding into global markets, had indeed begun to squeeze out their Western competitors by offering electric vehicles that were 30 to 40% cheaper. By that time, almost 1 in 5 new cars in Canada was of Chinese origin. But in the west of the country, where millions of people lived off agricultural exports to China, anxiety was growing. In Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta, farmers understood that Beijing's response would be inevitable. When the Prime Minister announced the tariffs in Parliament, the chamber gave him a standing ovation. The press called it a historic moment of economic sovereignty. At the same time, the reaction on Chinese news channels was cold and restrained no threats, just phrases about mutual damage and violation of fair trade principles. But in diplomatic circles, countermeasures were already being discussed. According to sources close to the Canadian Ministry of Trade, even before the new year, the Chinese side warned Ottawa that if the tariffs were not lifted, the response would hit the most vulnerable point: agricultural exports. This warning was ignored.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
The tariff came into effect on January 1st, 2025. Inspections began at the border, and hundreds of containers with Chinese electric vehicles were detained. The market reacted instantly, prices for the remaining models skyrocketed, and dealers sold out all available stock within a week. At the time, the government assured that domestic manufacturers would fill the market in a few months. However, the conversation was quite different at the General Motors Canada and Stellantis plants in Windsor. Production lines were not ready, modernization was slow, and supply chains from lithium batteries to microchips remained dependent on Asian partners. While Ottawa tried to keep control of the situation, Beijing struck a blow that few expected on such a scale. In February, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce announced the introduction of 75.8% tariffs on Canadian canola, peas, and barley. This move was the economic equivalent of a pinpoint strike to the heart of the prairies. Within a week, canola futures plummeted 28%, thousands of farmers froze shipments, and elevators filled with unsold grain. For regions where 1 in 4 families lived off exports to China, it was a shock.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by
Canadian farmers, accustomed to stability, suddenly found themselves at the epicenter of a trade conflict they did not start. Newspapers published photos of empty farms, tractors parked on the side of the road, and people forced to sell their equipment to pay off loans. Grain cooperatives in towns like Moose Jaw and Lethbridge were closing. At the same time, the government in Ottawa repeated the same mantra: we need time to adapt. By the spring of 2025, the crisis had become systemic. Canada lost not only its market, but also the trust of investors. International rating agencies began to revise their economic growth forecasts. Banks recorded an increase in debt in the agricultural sector, and voices in Parliament increasingly called for a review of tariff policy. Despite official statements of steadfastness, disputes flared up within the government. The ministers of agriculture and industry openly clashed at meetings. Behind the scenes, it was said that even some of the Prime Minister's advisors warned that without negotiations with Beijing, the consequences could be irreversible. Beijing, meanwhile, remained calm. Chinese media reported on the reliability of domestic suppliers and the active replacement of Canadian canola with products from Kazakhstan and Argentina. For Canada, this was not just an economic challenge, it was a signal. A country accustomed to feeling stable and secure suddenly found itself drawn into a big game where the stakes were set by others. At the same time, the first voices of dissent began to be heard in Canada. The head of one of the western provinces openly stated that the federal government sacrificed farmers for the sake of Ontario. These words caused an uproar. At rallies in Regina and Calgary, posters appeared with the slogan "Our fields are not bargaining chips." Dissatisfaction grew on social media. Tens of thousands of users demanded that tariffs be lifted and the Chinese market be restored. The government responded with promises of compensation, but the amounts were negligible compared to the actual losses.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Meanwhile, analysts began to warn that a blow to the agricultural sector could lead to a domino effect. After all, agricultural regions are not only suppliers of raw materials, but also the basis of domestic demand. When farmers lose income, other industries suffer, from logistics to trade. By the summer of 2025, the recession in rural provinces had become apparent. Against this backdrop, Canada attempted to strengthen its alliance with Washington, hoping for support from the White House. But Donald Trump's administration chose a different path. In public statements, he not only supported the idea of tariffs, but also accused Canada of being soft on China. This came as a shock to Ottawa. At a time when the country needed allies, its closest partner began to distance itself. Moreover, American tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum soon followed, which only exacerbated internal economic difficulties.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Thus, the attempt to protect the auto industry led to Canada being caught between two trade giants. Tariffs on electric vehicles did not have the expected effect. The domestic market was in deficit, and exports were stagnant. It was only after several months that the government began to realize the scale of what had happened. Then the first hints of a possible revision of the tariff policy appeared. But by that time, farmers had already lost hundreds of millions, and millions of citizens had lost trust in the authorities. The bet made in 2024 was supposed to be a symbol of strength. It turned into a crisis that divided the country into two camps: those who believe in protectionism and those who see it as a path to self-isolation. And now, as political support has begun to melt away, even the most ardent supporters of tariffs are forced to admit that the trade war, which began with slogans about sovereignty, has turned into a struggle for the survival of their own economy. By mid-2025, it had become clear in Ottawa that the former confidence had given way to anxiety. The government tried to maintain its previous line, repeating that the 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles would remain until the market stabilizes. But the word stability sounded less and less convincing. After months of pressure from farmers, journalists, and regional leaders, internal contradictions within the government began to surface. Questions that had previously been considered almost seditious were increasingly being asked in Parliament. Is it worth continuing the trade war if it destroys our own economy? Public opinion was changing rapidly, while at the beginning of the conflict the majority of Canadians supported a tough policy against Beijing. By the summer, the proportion of supporters had almost halved. In the western provinces, where farmers had lost their largest market, approval ratings for federal policy plummeted to record lows. The first cracks in the government's monolithic rhetoric appeared when one of the economic ministers acknowledged that under current conditions, trade isolation does more harm than good. This statement drew a barrage of criticism from protectionists, but behind the scenes it was supported by many MPs. In private conversations, they said that the economy was suffocating under its own restrictions. Canada has lost not only exports but also domestic consumer momentum. Against the backdrop of rising inflation and declining purchasing power, it is tariffs on electric vehicles that have become a symbol of the government's inefficiency.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Against this backdrop, the visit of the head of one of the western provinces to Beijing attracted particular attention, a move that many called a regional uprising. Formally, the trip was private, but the Chinese side perceived it as a signal of readiness for dialogue. Photos from the meetings in the ministries instantly spread through the world media, and Canadian news outlets began talking about a disruption of the Federation. But unexpectedly, the Prime Minister did not condemn the visit. On the contrary, in his public statements, for the first time in a long time, he spoke of the need to review certain elements of tariff policy. For many, this was a sign that Ottawa was preparing for a turnaround. Soon, the foreign minister also allowed for the possibility of flexible tariff adjustments. Her words that Canada should expand partnerships with Japan, South Korea, and Europe, but not close the door on China, sparked lively debate. The opposition accused the government of capitulation, while the business community welcomed the cautious departure from the hard line. Even representatives of the automotive industry, for which the tariff was introduced in the first place, began to express doubts. Against the backdrop of subsidy cuts and falling sales, they saw that protectionism was no longer a defense, it had become a trap. The situation in the electric vehicle market looked disastrous at that point. Sales had fallen by almost 40%, and this was not just a statistic, it was a blow to the idea of a green transition, of which Ottawa was so proud. One province after another was winding down its support programs. British Columbia cancelled regional discounts on electric vehicle purchases, and Quebec barely managed to keep its program alive after mass protests. For the average buyer, an electric car became a luxury that was unaffordable even with federal incentives. Gasoline models once again dominated the roads, and analysts warned that if the trend continued, Canada would not meet its climate goals even by 2030.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
The paradox was that the same Chinese models that had been lost to the market could have filled this gap. They were cheaper, more technologically advanced, and exactly what consumers needed. But the tariff made them an unattainable commodity. Canadian factories did not have time to increase production. Many companies froze investments, fearing instability. Layoffs began in Windsor and Oshawa, and companies that switched to battery production faced a shortage of components and rising costs. While the auto industry was struggling with internal conflicts, pressure from the agricultural sector was mounting. Farmers demanded action. Their protests under the slogan "Give us back our market" drew thousands of people. These slogans united not only canola producers, but also transporters, processors, and logisticians, an entire chain dependent on Chinese demand. For the government, this turned into a political trap. Any concession to China looked like a defeat, but without concessions, the country was losing billions. The first internal consultations began in May. According to local media, 3 scenarios were discussed: maintaining the current regime, complete abolition, or partial mitigation. The latter option was unofficially named the Carney Compromise. It was proposed to reduce tariffs on some models and at the same time require Chinese manufacturers to open assembly plants in Canada.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
This would have provided an opportunity to restore balance, returning affordable cars to consumers, revitalizing the market, and preserving jobs. However, this proposal met with resistance within the country. Auto industry unions feared that the opening of Chinese factories would lead to the displacement of local manufacturers. They demanded firm guarantees that foreign companies would not receive tax breaks. At the same time, free trade advocates argued that without outside investment, Canada would simply not be able to overcome its technological lag. Economists warned that time was working against Ottawa. Every week of uncertainty was driving away investors and weakening the currency. Meanwhile, the crisis began to spill over into the political arena. Against the backdrop of falling popularity, the government faced internal opposition. Several MPs left the party, demanding an open review of tariff policy. Leaks began to appear in the media about closed meetings where options for a phased removal of restrictions were discussed. At the same time, contacts were being made with Tokyo and Seoul in an attempt to compensate for the loss of the Chinese market with new partners. But these negotiations progressed slowly. Asia already saw Canada as a country with an unpredictable trade policy. While politicians argued, the real sector continued to lose ground. Against the backdrop of a weakening Canadian dollar, imported parts became more expensive, and consumers increasingly postponed large purchases. Car dealerships recorded record downtime, parking lots were empty, and service centers reduced shifts. Journalists wrote that the country that started a trade war for jobs is now losing them faster than ever. By the fall, the situation had shifted from economic to socio-political. Farm protests merged with urban rallies against rising prices and cuts to support programs. Slogans appeared on the streets of Toronto and Vancouver: "Stop paying for Ottawa's mistakes." These were no longer isolated industry protests. This was the discontent of an entire country. Against this backdrop of pressure, the Prime Minister was forced to admit that some elements of the policy need to be reviewed. These words, spoken live on air, sounded like a signal for change.